Hello and welcome to this NCC Group virtual event, Ransomware, a Survival Guide. Today with you we have two of our finest, but I shall let them introduce themselves. Lloyd, Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, Scott Burman. I'm NCC Group's Global Risk Advisory Lead. I have the privilege of leading teams across the globe. Mainly we solve all of our clients, in partnership with our customers, our clients' customer cyber risk challenges.
Leonard?
Hi, Lloyd Brough. I'm a Technical Director at NCC Group. I was one of the founder members of the NCC pen test team, and now I run the Security Improvement and Remediation team.
Brilliant, thanks both. Well, we have a huge amount of content to get through today. Ransomware is at the forefront of everyone's minds, and with these attacks becoming more prevalent and more damaging, how is the threat landscape for ransomware developing?
So, it's a good
big question to start you off with.
Big old question, yeah. So, the cyber threat actors, so the people taking advantage of network security issues, you know, they're using common vulnerabilities. In all honesty, they're often not hard to exploit. It's generally the second stage when they're using comparably more sophisticated techniques. So, the key thing really to understand is that the landscape's always changing, the hacking landscape. You know, as our interconnectivity of systems becomes more and more entwined, the MO of attackers will change as well. Okay, so the modus operandi has changed recently. I'll give you a quick overview of how ransomware has evolved. So it's now human operated, but to get to that point, we went through a few stages. Initially, probably 2013, 2014, we kind of started to see single instances of ransomware, which would encrypt a specific machine. And that was, you know, an annoyance quite often, particularly if it was somebody that had key files on their laptop. And then they started to evolve and become more network aware. So if you imagine that, you know, the large scale network shares that people often used to use and some people are still using, you know, the ransomware became aware of network shares and so would encrypt that data as well. But then things started to evolve. And we went through WannaCry and NotPetya, which was a self-propagating worm using an exploit that was actually leaked as part of shadow brokers. And that in itself really opened a lot of people's eyes. Then we moved on to much more advanced and malicious angle. So the attackers are now human operated, right? So they've got they're trying to find the best way possible in order to create as much devastation as possible. That's a guaranteed thing if you're going to get done by ransomware. So the demand for sums of money, that's not changed. We're seeing the vectors change, becoming a bit more sophisticated, but the effects that it's becoming more and more damaging. And you've got to remember also that ransomware is generally a symptom of poor cyber hygiene. It's pretty much the same as you will see with other security related issues. But from my perspective, what I find interesting about it is the impact that ransomware has made boards sit up and listen. Whereas previously cybersecurity findings were sometimes a bit ethereal and difficult to get hold of, but now this has a real impact to businesses. Yeah,
they've actually got sight of it and are understanding more of the risks. Scott, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think just to touch on a few points Lloyd made, I think we're seeing the attacks becoming more frequent, more damaging, and particularly around the zero-day vulnerabilities. Recently with Log4j, the ransomware gangs are using those flaws, such as Log4Shell, to launch their attacks. And this is kind of happening in a sense alongside the proliferation of ransomware as a service, which will obviously lead to an exponential damage scale for organisations. But these models are a top threat. I think we know that. But this part of that has been driven by the growth in popularity of cryptocurrencies, and allowing attackers to hide, to be anonymous whilst demanding payment. So we've got this. So it's a new model. New model's increasing. We've got the technology evolving around fileless and cryptojacking. So we've got harder to detect viruses and not always reliant on the traditional vectors such as phishing, a complex environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think with ransomware, it's incredibly easy to get buried in the technical details, and we look at all that content, but it's really important, I guess, to look at the role that people play in this and the human side of building resilience. Like, can we expand on that a little bit and cover?
Absolutely. I mean, people are fairly or unfairly described as, the weakest link in security. There's seminal work around users not the enemy by SAS, etc., etc. But You know, for me, I think people are often the strength. You know, technology will get you so far, but it's the human in the loop that's ultimately going to increase your resilience. And I'm not just pointing the finger where things go wrong, but I think organisations often don't recognise the power of good relationships between teams that are dealing with incidents, not just in the team, but wider in the business ecosystem as well. So, you know, and coupled with that is the ability to train in stressful but benign environments, just to increase that sort of muscle memory. And I guess for CISOs maybe listening today, you know, they're fully aware the CISO role is a leadership role. This is a security leadership role in the organisation. And it's all about leading and championing information security through people, process, technology. But it's often the people side that drifts sometimes. And the focus on people that drifts, and that leads to, you know, effectively the investment, the return on investment people can give you exponential returns in your ransomware resilience. So sometimes it just needs a shift in focus.
Yeah, and actually look at sort of the impact of that.
Yeah, I think so.
Lloyd, I guess obviously you've sort of both have very similar and different inputs. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is all a spectrum, right? From governance all the way through to technical, and you know, some people would probably note that I do often get buried in the detail and technical details. So I'll try not to do that now. Just building on the human side of things. So, you probably know I used to run the NCC Group IR practice as the incident response team, and you know, they do some great work, and it was really sort of obvious to me when we were doing some more of the more involved investigations that there is a lot of pressure placed on individuals that often become the linchpin in organisations. You know, I'm sure some CISOs out there will probably relate to this, that actually they have a person in their organisation, let's call them Brent, for example. There's a book we can reference on that. But they become the linchpin, right? And in the investigation and in the recovery process, say from ransomware, even if you've got all your backups in place and all this kind of stuff, then actually, you know, the amount of pressure that is placed on those individuals, you know, that's your single constraint. That's your one person that actually is going to get you out of this. And the pressure is not just around getting the business up and running, because let's be honest, ransomware, the intent behind the ransomware operators is to cripple your business. That is why you're going to pay the money, hopefully, from their perspective. It's not something that as an organisation we would recommend, obviously. There's often a lot of really hard questions coming down about when it's going to be done. You know, how fast is it going to be done? Are we going to have access to this data? It's a lot of pressure. It comes from the board. It comes from end users.
What's the damage? What's the damage?
Exactly. And so it's really tough. And I've seen people fold, and you know, I find it really, really difficult. And IR is stressful anyway, right?
I'd probably say so. Yeah, as roles go.
So I mean, as an aside, I would obviously make having run an IR team, you know, call the IR team slightly sooner. It's generally about 4:30 on a Friday that people call. So I used to joke about, you know, discounts on a Tuesday, but that would be great. But you know, it's a difficult, stressful experience, and just thinking about the people and the impact it has on those people. You know, I guess it could be quite personal as well, and really just the pressure. You know, maybe the technology not working quite like you expected to, or that backup not being in place, you know, it could fall apart and it could be really quite stressful.
Yeah, and that kind of pressure and that stress obviously then impacts on teams, and it becomes really, really difficult to manage. And everyone is incredibly obviously proud of their security strategy. So I guess building on that human element, like what sort of, you know, recommendations or what could we look at in terms of measures that organisations could take? I
think Lloyd's right. I think we've got a situation from most security teams and wider where security as BAU is you're running hot. Okay, the team's running hot generally. So I guess what you need to do really is to look at you need to do more with less. You've got a backdrop with a great resignation. I think we all know the difficulties in retaining key staff. So you've got to, with all of that in mind, what you need to do generally, I mean, it is a complex area, is to look at maybe things along the lines of cross-skilling. So where you've got specialisms in the team, look at sharing the knowledge across the teams. So on what I would call diluting that reliance on specialisms.
Yeah.
So you've got the ability to pick up the slack across the team. Also, when an incident hits, those specialists are going to fail very, very quickly if they're running hot, as Lloyd says, if they're running hot in the BAU space. Now, the other things you could look at really, and we've seen organisations do this, is to really analyse the role of the security team in its BAU sense. So, are they dealing with requests for information? Are those requests repetitive?
Yeah.
You know, is there anything about the efficiency of what they do? Whether you could automate some of this, whether whether there's robotic processes there that RPA could play a place in. So, again, efficiency and automation, but ultimately it's about cross-skilling the team.
Yeah.
And improving the culture in the team, which perhaps we can talk about in a second. But yeah, I mean, these are just some suggestions.
Yeah, of course, and obviously alleviating pressures on those single units and actually making sure you've got a bit of division of responsibility maybe, or division of levels.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, so I've been in organisations where, just that. So, the cyber insurance is up for renewal, so there's a whole host of requests. There's a board paper due, a whole host of requests fly. It's the same information, or when a ransomware incident hits, where do we go to get information about configuration management? How do we, where do we go to get our asset inventories and all this good stuff? And I think if there's two things there: there's preparedness and understanding what's required and doing that in a benign but stressful environment. But there's also parts of this where it's automation and relieving pressure for those roles that you could see that by relieving pressure would add benefit to your resilience to ransomware, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we look at how obviously we manage incidents, or we sort of prepare for those incidents, we often think about who our partners are or who we work with in terms of security partners. So it'd be really good to kind of understand, I guess, from both your perspectives, why partnerships would be quite important for building that strategy.
I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, so partnerships. So it's two flavours really. I mean, broadly speaking, there's the relationships with suppliers. So many people listening today may have an outsourced security function. So there's the partnership and the need to be a partner with that kind of relationship with the supplier. There's also partnerships in the broader ecosystem of the area you operate. And we've seen some really powerful ways in which organisations can not only work within their sector or ecosystem, but look broader for non-traditional areas that they would seek to sort of form partnerships. And I remember speaking to a client who had a bilateral relationship outside of their sector, because I think they recognised quite quickly that cybersecurity is a global problem.
Yeah.
And in order to counter that threat, you need to have a sort of broader, defensive sort of partnership going on and a relationship there. And they benefit from that. And I think there was some statistics from the World Economic Forum, their Outlook series, that talked about, security leaders and organisations gaining over 90% gained actionable insight from partnerships, much broader than their own ecosystems. That's quite a powerful statistic. And I guess the other thing around relationships or partnerships with suppliers goes back to the preparedness aspect.
Yes.
So if you've got, for example, if you're training, if you're doing some preparedness exercises, some simulation, you absolutely must have those people who you will need to call upon during an incident involved in your training and preparedness. Some examples being, an outsourced security function, or you may have an IR retainer on board who can do forensics. You need to make sure that they understand their relationship, you understand theirs, and they are bought in and are part of your preparedness improvement processes by getting involved in training.
I guess it goes right the way through the stack, right? You've often got organisations, particularly large, complex organisations, where they have different entities managing, say, the tin, the platform, the application, and it's really important for the person who is engaged those organisations to understand where the demarcation points are. Because quite often it's very difficult to get straight answers, particularly under pressure in a ransomware situation. Yeah,
I think it's probably something that creates the most pressure, if not. And then obviously when we sort of look at those incidents and we look at preparedness and everything like that, we naturally think about how we look at that resilience and how we develop resilience in teams.
Yeah. Just thinking slightly more on that partnership. Just part of the MO of recent ransomware is actually third parties that have access to networks being used as a way to get access to networks, which is a sort of quite interesting change in MO. And it goes back to like APT 10 was a similar idea too. So it's important that actually, as an organisation, when you do use third parties, not just only understanding what the contractual situation is, but also understanding what access they have to your estate as well.
Yeah.
And making sure that that organisation is also applying the same rigour they would to their environment to your environment too. If they've got user accounts on your estate with terrible passwords that all match the same, and an attacker will take advantage of that. So it's important that, as part of that process, you understand where they've got access to. As part of this, you're going to map your own estate, and I'll come to this later a little bit, mapping your own estate and, trying to make sure that you understand exactly who's got access to what part.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's a really good
tangent there.
No, but it's a really good point. I think actually kind of knowing your estate comes back to the point, that you were making very much at the beginning, is that attackers will manipulate anything they can, and it is a constantly changing, mode of threat, really. Yeah. So it highlights that all the way through.
I think, and they need to, particularly for outsourced security providers, I think they need to understand the culture and the culture of your organisation as part of that. And you might think, well, why is that important? I think generally to have a transactional relationship when it comes to security is not going to help. And I think to understand and get them bought in and built into your culture in the training environment is going to be a really powerful thing. Just to understand where, for example, there may be interfaces or friction points across the teams, intra-team, extra-team, in the organisation, but also with the supplier relationships. And I think to identify those early in the BAU, in the relatively benign areas, is a useful thing to do, because when a ransomware incident hits, these are the areas that are going to suffer most.
Yeah. When
you either don't have that relationship you thought was in place, or it's not quite the same thing, or the culture's different. So again, just worth thinking about in terms of partnerships and relationships.
Yeah, and getting really sort of embedded into that and the organisational structure.
Yeah.
So when we look at sort of developing this resilience then, and organisations accepting things are going to happen, how are we going to improve our resilience, or how are we going to become more aware?
Yeah, it's interesting, acceptance, isn't it? I think we if you probably go back a year or two ago, we would always talk about when, not if, and I think now it's just a case of it's going to happen. And I think broadly speaking, most people are in that space now. So assumed acceptance, and then so we were talking about resilience now. Resilience is a slightly different thing to preparedness, but without getting into a semantic debate, I think broadly speaking, you could boil it down into a number of factors, really, organisational factors. We've touched on the human factor side, I think, and the partnerships, but there's something about understanding the cyber risks. And when I say understanding that, I mean, spending time to develop the risk scenarios that are most likely to impact your organisation, quantify them, put them in a measurable way so that you understand where changes in the environment, whether it's threat capability, whether it's control strengths, can have, and you can see a tangible return on investment or change in the risk capital of a risk just by tweaking, parts of that risk equation. We've got to move away from, and I think most organisations are, but maybe accelerate that away from this, risk by Excel scenario where you write, the aim is to produce as many risks as you possibly can. Well, you could find just by effort in risk scenario development, getting the right people in the room, maybe using some of the quantified risk methodology that you can actually get some really tangible, you boil that down to almost 3 or 4 or 5 top risks, quantified risks, allow you really to focus your effort. Once you focus your effort, you really will address most of the risks, cyber risks that exist in your organisation.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously those risks have to be bespoke to your business, because obviously everyone's risk is going to be completely different.
I think as an aside to that, there are some sort of, I kind of refer to it as getting the basics right, I guess. there's some things that match the attacker's MO that actually are basic building blocks that probably don't differ across organisations, and most of those are fairly simple. So we can cover those off shortly. I can talk you through those, but I think that's really important to get that level of sort of basics right in order to manage the more sort of like the further risks, like things that and then backup resilience and all those kind of things. I mean, talking slightly on cyber resilience actually, and I think it's one thing that COVID has shown us is that the kind of BCP DR and cyber resilience, they're kind of all kind of a bit conflated now, and actually that's they are subtly different, but there are obviously similarities. You know, COVID has shown us that organisations have been able to work remotely, and I'm sure obviously it affected a lot of businesses. Of course it did, but a lot of organisations have been able to work effectively remotely, which is fantastic, and to some degree that's kind of refocused efforts. So that's quite interesting. But just to think a little bit more about that resilience angle, things like backups are, you know, super important.
We hear it mentioned a lot, don't we? Backups.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But it's things that are as you know, cyber resilience includes things like standard processes, as I'm sure Scott will tell you about, the kind of even just that the starts and leavers process, you know, and account management, all the IAM stuff, the, you know, password management, legacy issues, all those kind of things are just as important in cyber resilience as planning for a disaster, right? So it's important that we start to think about those in terms of the overall cyber risk and the effect that those would have on the business, but also, you know, is likely ransomware likely to get deployed.
Yeah. So obviously organisations don't necessarily want to wait for the next disaster. No. What could we look at maybe that they could, you know, either review or put in place?
I think there's a number of things that, you know, for example, you know, to get independent assurance of your ransomware preparedness through, you know, readiness assessment, through, you know, some sort of compromise assessment, whether that's, you know, light touch threat hunting, or even, you know, much broader, a whole cybersecurity review of your estate to give you that real rich holistic picture of your maturity. These are great things to do. These are independent assurance, probably outside of your organisation. It'll just give you a sense of your as is and where you need to start. If it's ransomware specific, I recommend you know, doing a specific exercise around ransomware preparedness. Yeah. The good news is, I think, if we talk in terms of recognised good practice, we've seen over the last 6 to 9 months an increase of standards, frameworks coming out. So we all know the NIST CSF. NIST have now got a ransomware risk profile. So it's an extraction of their CSF, but with rationales around which parts it's taken out to measure or assess against your state. We've seen Secure Controls Framework have a ransomware flavoured element to theirs. And, you know, the frameworks are out there, the recognised good practice exists, and the good news is, going back to Lloyd's point, is you can map that all the way back through control sets. CIS 18's got a fantastic control set prioritised for you, cloud ready, you know, really good, powerful stuff. And there's strong mappings between these, whether it's high-level frameworks, control sets, all the way through to the TTPs that MITRE ATT&CK presents. That's the good news.
Always good to get that in there.
They exist, you know, and I think that once you understand that, once you've got an idea of what work's required and the improvement plan you need and the remediation process, you start that journey, and it could be that it's a check and balance on what you're doing already, where you just need to sort of adjust the tiller, or, you know, you need to just really focus across and think about the bigger risks that you've got based on those kind of independent assurances.
Yeah. I think we've heard obviously a lot of sort of key focus areas and things that we need to do, and, you know, getting the basics right. So we've got an audience full of security professionals right across the, you know, different industries. Yep. What could we do as our key takeaways? I say we. What could we all do as our key takeaways today, absolutely, Lloyd? Absolutely.
So, as I guess I've already said, you know, I think one of the key things for you know, surviving ransomware. In fact, let's take a step back. There's probably two real key things. One is to try and make you look slightly less attractive, right? Which I can work with, right? Get the basics right, and I'll talk about all those in a second. The second is probably to think about the resilience of the backup, and to combine all of those things into thinking about it from an attack chain perspective. So when I say get the basics right, you know, sadly, most organisations that are done over by ransomware, it comes from a fairly simple situation at the moment. Yeah. Right? So it's generally a simple mistake. It's something that's exposed to the internet that shouldn't be. Legacy infrastructure, some multi-factor authentication that isn't there on your external perimeter. And often organisations, particularly ones that have got a large infrastructure, maybe disparate across, they don't always know what their perimeter looks like. Yeah. You know, asset management always comes number one on whatever framework you're doing assessment to, right? But actually, in the kind of, I guess, in the real world, you know, actually what's visible outside is a slightly different question.
Yeah.
And you know, I can't not mention phishing at that point, right?
It's got to be done.
So to get the basics right, you need to think about, you know, securing, you know, reducing the footprint externally, making sure that you think about from an attack chain perspective whether or not somebody could, if they got a shell on one of your desktops, can they move from that box easily? So just sort of changing hats slightly a little bit, you know, if you put your admin's hat on and ask yourself some simple questions, right? So let's assume a compromise. Somebody's got access to your admin credentials, your domain admin, okay?
It's a bad day.
Well, it's probably a bad day, right? You know, could my admin delete my backups so that I could not recover them? Is that possible? So, for example, we have seen many situations where the VM infrastructure, the hypervisors, or the backup system, or other key systems, including things like source control and cloud systems, you know, are all authenticated to Active Directory. And I have to say that, you know, Active Directory, whilst it's incredibly functional, it's quite hard to secure. We obviously have a lot of experts that can come help people secure that as best as can be done, but you know, it's a very difficult thing to do. So it's important to kind of think about those questions, you know. Basically, can somebody with single-factor authentication, my admin credentials, maybe they match their standard user account, maybe somebody's browsing the internet with domain admin, that's a bad idea, don't do that.
Point number one.
You know, if you can ask those simple questions and think about it from that perspective, that's really key.
Yeah.
So the way that we try to approach the ransomware survival is to combine all of these things we've been talking about with cyber risk management processes, to combine that with understanding if the technical controls, if the efficacy of the technical controls is in place, to make sure that you understand from the attack chain, if you model a whole thing on the attack chain, based around threat intel and whatever else is available to you, you can understand how those attack modus operandi and those TTPs could affect your organization and what defenses you need to put in play. We have a package that we put together for this, which basically combines effectively pen testing and you know, audit against frameworks, and then builds up a picture that creates a plan to go forwards. Generally, you know, we do that white box, which is really good because you get a lot of value for money.
Yes.
And you're able to kind of like hopefully secure your environment. If you can make yourself look less attractive, as I was saying before, then basically, hopefully the attacker will move on somewhere else. That is not to say that you won't get attacked, or somebody might accidentally click on a phishing link, put the credentials in, or something like that. It's all possible. You know, organizations like Microsoft are really, you know, they're really trying to raise the bar. They've recently prevented macros, which is often a way that you get into an estate. I mean, it's not perfect. There's going to be ways around it. So on top of all of that, make sure you've got things like continuous security monitoring in place. The reason I say that is to think about, there's often a dwell time. From initial access, the miscreant is trying to get through the estate and find out what to do to make it as their attack, their impact as big as possible. There's quite often a dwell time. If your protective monitoring is good at that point, and you follow up an alert and then act on potentially suspicious activity, you're much more likely to prevent the ransomware in the first place.
Yeah.
When you see the ransomware note, probably too late at that point. That's when you need to start thinking about
hitting panic buttons.
Yeah, exactly. Start thinking about that. So really, to try and embed that security, like from first principles. Yeah. Oh, whilst I think about first principles, test your backups from first principles as well. I've seen organisations where they had done fantastic backups of an application. It was all authenticated to the Active Directory. They hadn't backed up the Active Directory because obviously it's resilient, right? But they also didn't have any AD domain controls in the cloud or anything like that. Ransomware had affected all those domain controllers, and so they couldn't authenticate to the application. They couldn't do their business. So that was pretty bad. But yeah, just talking about first principles, applying that kind of, I think Scott initially said it, talked about the, trying to make sure you embed that into your processes and your thought process in product application, service design, your infrastructure design, and like being more strategic in the kind of thinking around, like, moving towards concepts like zero trust and managed devices and, a modern endpoint would be a real good way to kind of move forwards. But that kind of culture and that sort of knowledge sharing, that's something that you have to kind of embed from, like, I guess CISO down and all technical directors and that kind of thing.
The whole organisation.
Yeah, into people. And I guess, Scott, you've done quite a lot more with security champions.
Yeah, we do in organisation, I think, and we'll see more of it. And the concept really is around identifying those people, those stakeholders within the organisation that aren't in the InfoSec community. So it could be someone in HR, could be someone in procurement, who just has a natural lean to security, an interest, call it what you will, but is willing to be an interface to your information security teams and just be a focal point, a liaison officer in that organisation and champion it. And I've seen organisations with walking around with I'm a security champion badges, but and more, and rewarding that behaviour. I guess it's about that. So having a really broad network, because it's very difficult as an InfoSec team to get into other parts into the BUs and get across the organisation, and it's just a great way of doing it. It has worked.
InfoSec just gets in the way, right? Most of the time.
It's a policeman, right? It's not an enabler. There you go.
Well, I think that's important to think about. From the perspective of a pen tester, which my origin point is, I guess. It's so easy to say, you've got to do that, you've really got to make it better. But actually understanding, the business requirements and, why an organisation's not done that is just as important. And if you can work with a client to, like, figure out, like, what a compensating control could look like for that and implement something slightly differently. Maybe it's just a sticking plaster for now, so you can be tactical, take that risk or reduce it at least, and then you can be more strategic. But I think that InfoSec needs to be an enabler to business as well as not just a blocker. And I guess hopefully we've gone from that space now. But that was, like, historically that was something that InfoSec, I guess, it was just a pain. Yeah, I think
it's moved from being a pain to being something that's actually crucial and it's an existential issue for businesses, particularly those that are cloud native or have started. From that position. So, just one point for me on. So Lloyd talked about the end-to-end, and the need to have some deep technical dives on some aspects of your independent assurance, and it's a really important point because what we often see with maturity assessments around and cybersecurity reviews, often they will take the category, the control, and look at that in an organisation and assess it in some way. Normally, a maturity score. But what we do, and I think the value really is to say, particularly around backup, so you can say, yes, there's backups, yes, they back up often, but there's definitely detail. And I think, what we tend to do is to have a deeper dive on backup resilience, because it literally, the devil is in the detail. And there'll be things, the examples that Lloyd brought out there, where a perceived backup maturity is actually, the reality of that is very, very different. So there's a value there of doing deep technical dives on some of the areas of some of the overarching frameworks we use.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, thinking about that from almost like a war game perspective.
Yeah, sure.
Am I able to actually recover from this situation if this occurs?
Yeah.
I think it's
before you've hit that button.
Well,
should we just test what we've put in place?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Well, thanks both. Obviously, some really, really key takeaways there. And as we have a very keen audience, we do have some great questions, which I think we'll move to, if that's okay. We'll take a couple. The first,
we'll try our best.
We'll try our best. Well, I say we. I'm going to be coming directly to you.
It's all on you.
So this first one is from Aaron, and they've said, what trends are you seeing with respect to OT ransomware? Is it really possible to take CNI asset hostage in exchange for ransomware?
Yeah, I mean...
yeah, straight up.
So you will generally see other bits of infrastructure affected around it as well, and it's really the interconnectedness of networks that's the concern realistically, and the fact that people don't have therefore visibility of whatever that bit of OT is doing. It is a real and credible threat that things are connected to networks? Yes.
Noted. Thank you for that. Slightly. It's always a big thing. It's difficult, isn't it?
This is my point about the defence in depth.
It's reality,
right?
Isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's all those things I talked about. Embedding security at the beginning of an organisation, but also building your desktop securely, and those initial access parts.
Starting it right from the beginning.
You can harden that lot there. That's going to really help.
Rather than doing everything from a backup.
I have to. I'll cross the thorny bridge of network segmentation, right?
Okay.
Okay. So this is like all the CISOs out there are going to be like, grinding their teeth at this point in time, because security professionals occasionally recommend that you segregate your network. It's not easy.
No.
Right.
I'm sure they'll all be relieved to hear that.
Yeah, totally. So it is the most important thing to think about. Once you've got all the basics right. If you've got environments like OT environments, they cannot be on the same network as your corporate infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? And you need to make sure that they are segregated and that segregation works. Having a rooted VLAN is not network separation, right? It's the same network. Okay, it's rooted. That's the point. So it needs firewalling. It needs jump-off boxes that have multi-factor authentication to get onto those to manage those critical assets, right? And realistically, you probably should be doing that in some sort of tiered authentication model, maybe thinking about similar ideas to kind of like Red Forest or privileged access workstations or something like that, in order to try and manage those things securely.
Yeah. No, really good recommendations. Moving into sort of, obviously, COVID has completely changed the way most businesses work who have been solely office-based. And we've got a question here from Lindsay that, given the hurry to make businesses work from home ready over the early days of COVID, how much cyber debt are you seeing, and which organisations still need to close down?
Many. The cyber debt. I mean, for some, unfortunately for some, the cyber debt is added to their legacy debt and the technical debt. So it's very, very painful for some. Normally, particularly in the telco sectors. I guess what we've seen for some clients really is to trade off those debts with some of the acceptance of the model. So, for example, if we think about COVID perpetuating and the hybrid model perpetuating, yes, it was a debt at the time, but what they're seeing is that redeployed in terms of a new hybrid model. Mm-hmm. So it's I guess what I'm trying to say is they're moving it to BAU space, which means it's probably reframing it. But yeah, go back to my original point. It's when it's lumped in with the existing debts, it's considerable, and it's mainly considerable for those organisations that have built up from legacy over the last 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, totally. I would echo that. The two things I saw when we came out of when we went into the kind of the last crazy years. The first.
There's no easy way to put that. It's been a bit bonkers.
No. There was the organisations that often had legacy.
Yeah.
That then would sometimes smaller organisations would expose a server to the internet for people to get access to, do it from their own machines at home, single-factor authentication. Generally, that is bad. I would not recommend that as an approach. The other type of organisation that we saw. There's probably a middle ground where people continued with their VPN and all those kind of things. The other type of organisation we saw are those that are cloud first in their principles and start to move towards zero trust quite quickly. And they've got things like certificate on machines, conditional access, multi-factor authentication all rolled in. Maybe using things like a cloud-based proxy back into their environment in order to access internal applications. So, I mean, people argue about zero trust a lot, but actually, all of those concepts are really good.
Yeah.
And will really kind of help an organisation maintain that remoteness. And also, if you can move everyone into zero trust type models and managed endpoints and all that sort of stuff, you can start to segregate your internal network a lot easier as well.
Making that first point of network segregation is really hard. A little bit easier.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise you to know that for zero trust, that's also a business change exercise. And I think it's often seen with a lens of a technical lens, and rightly so, because there are things that need to happen in terms of micro segmentation, etc., etc. But the actual transition, the move to, or even laying the foundations for a move to zero trust is establishing, all the business change aspects you'd expect from any transformation, and to not have that sort of powerful triumvirate of program management and system engineering and business change. Somewhere in there, if it's not balanced, you're gonna lose out. So always see Zero Trust as a business change exercise if you don't already. But obviously, yes, it's technically driven.
Yeah, definitely. Well, some brilliant points. I think we've got time for just one last question there, and this is from Annalisa. Do you think ransomware will remain the top threat in 2022? What do you see catching up or overtaking ransomware in the next few months or years?
So, I guess ransomware is a symptom of cybersecurity issues, right? But ransomware, and as Scott pointed out, rise of cryptocurrency, that kind of thing, has allowed it to be basically monetized, right? So this is that's the bottom line, isn't it, right?
Yeah.
So yes, I think ransomware will stay. The approach may change a little bit. We've already seen that anyway, because people steal data as well as encrypting stuff now as well, and threaten to leak it. So it will definitely be something that stays. As I say, the MO might change. Like, actually, you could see a terrible situation occur where maybe there's a new 0 day. Maybe you end up with human-operated ransomware, but it's also self-propagating with this 0 day that moves through an estate really quickly, or
Let's hope not.
Yeah. So that it could get worse.
Yeah.
But I do think there is some optimism here to think about, and as Scott and I were just talking about things like Zero Trust, and everyone is trying really hard, right?
Which is a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. From vendors down, and I think generally things are getting better, but it's still just as important to make sure you assess all this stuff and to check that it is securely configured, because actually, time and time again when we do testing, we will find that actually something that is designed well, there's just a little bit of implementation issue that's wrong, that lets it down, or
be able to identify what that is.
Exactly. So I think it's ransomware is still there, but I think testing and that kind of thing and continuous security improvement needs to be the thing that will save you from ransomware.
Yeah. I think that for this year, you're absolutely right. I think for this year, yes, it will still remain. I think what we're going to see towards the end of the year, and maybe this is partly due to sort of geopolitical events as well, I think we're going to get to a point where countries have what I call ransomware fatigue. And the result, the impact of that would be, I think we're going to see stronger regulation driving some of the improvements we talked about today. I think we're going to get to a point where, maybe not this year, but moving into the next year or so, where governments will, consider powers to shut down systems, shut down parts of the sector, whatever is required. I think there's going to be a strengthening around regulation and nation-state intervention.
Yeah.
The status quo is untenable, I think.
Definitely. Well, lots of key takeaways. A room obviously full of audience questions. If anybody hasn't had their question answered, please feel free to reach out and we'll get those back to everyone and get those published. But I guess massive thank you to both of you today.
Thank you.
I think I definitely would have struggled without you here, to be honest. But thank you for everybody for joining, and we really appreciate everybody's time. And please reach out. You have any questions, you need any support, or you want to share knowledge, then we're absolutely here. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.